special edition of the Office Hours with a new guest that I think a lot of you have not seen before. Um, I don't know if you do streaming elsewhere, Jamie. I should have asked about that. But Jamie MacDonald is our senior security engineer at Rasa. So we had our first, I believe, security advisory that went out last week. Some of y'all might have gotten an email about it. I'm sure, for those of you who've been, developing stuff for a while, you've probably gotten other security advisories, but this is the first Rasa one. So I would love if, to start out, you would talk about A, what does it mean when you get a security advisory? And then B, dig a little bit deeper down into what this issue was that we thought was important enough to let everyone know, like, hey, you need to fix it.
Sure. So yeah, in general, a security advisory is something that a product issues when they find a vulnerability. And usually the vulnerability is then fixed, and then they issue an advisory to kind of let everybody know who uses the product that they will want to update, or they'll want to introduce some kind of mitigating controls or a workaround if they can't update at that time. And the idea behind that, and the idea behind us doing it, is basically to be transparent about the things that we found and make sure that enterprise customers and end users who build with or on Rasa are aware of a vulnerability that we've discovered, and they can kind of apply fixes for that or mitigations in the product that they're using.
Great.
So in terms of the actual issue we have, it's a vulnerability that is known as a zip slip, which is more formally and more boringly called an archive extraction vulnerability. So basically what that is where code has a capability to extract an archive file like a tar or a zip or something. That archive file can be crafted in such a way that when it's extracted, the files are extracted out with the directory that you anticipate the file's going to. So they can almost kind of escape the bounds that you think you're putting them in. And that can then lead to having kind of arbitrary write capabilities into other areas of the file system that you don't expect and that the product doesn't intend.
And that's dangerous because someone might use it to run malicious code or steal your compute time to mine Bitcoin, say, or something else like that.
Exactly. So to achieve kind of like execution of code, that would generally need to be like chained with another vulnerability to which we haven't. We're not saying that we have, but generally that would need to have another vulnerability that would kind of allow for that code execution. But the risk comes where if the locations that can be written to using this vulnerability are not constrained in some way using kind of like operating system controls, you could overwrite like a script or an executable that another aspect of the operating system or another program uses, and then it could be executed through that.
So definitely something that you don't want to happen. We're not saying that it is currently happening. We're saying that we are preventing it from happening with this update.
Yes, exactly. That's what this patch is about. It's about preventing kind of the first stage in a chain of events which could lead to something that's not ideal. Yeah.
Great. And we have a question from Amina. Hi, Amina. What is the difference between a vulnerability and a bug?
Oh, great question. Okay. So I suppose a vulnerability is kind of a subset of a bug, I guess, where specifically a vulnerability has some kind of security impact. So it's not just a functional issue, it's one that can degrade or impact the security of the device that it's running on or the application as well.
Okay, I was just checking to see if there was a follow-up question. Great, thank you, Jamie. So I think the next question is, so there was this vulnerability, and you've gone into detail about what that is. We issued a security advisory. What does that mean? What should you do as a Rasa developer at this point?
Sure. Okay. So the easiest and most important thing to do is just to update. So if you're using Rasa open source, 2.8.10 or later have the fix. And if you're using Rasa X, 0.42.4 or later have the fix. So that's the most straightforward thing. If you can update, please do. If you can't update, then there are kind of mitigating steps that you can put in place to reduce the likelihood that you you fall victim to some exploit of this, which again is not something that we've seen, but it's nice to be um, prepared in advance. So for this, you really want to make sure that the HTTP API endpoint that Rasa has is not exposed directly to the internet. It's not a good practice. We suggest that you don't do this anyway. But having that exposed and having it internet facing without any authentication on it is kind of leaving you open and vulnerable to having someone exploit this. So if you build an application that uses Rasa, by all means expose that to the internet if that's the functionality that it's designed for. But have that talk to Rasa over a private link. Don't expose Rasa directly onto the internet. And if you're running kind of in a multi-tenanted environment where lots of other people might have access to the machine that you're running Rasa on, make sure that they don't have access to the command line, or only people that you trust with access have access to the command line and can interact with Rasa that way as well.
Definitely. So just to reiterate your point, I have my Rasa server running. It should not be exposed directly so that people can HTTP in. It should be talking to wherever I'm serving the assistant, and then that should be exposed, and then that should have some form of authentication so that I know who I'm talking to and that they can't do arbitrary things.
Yes, exactly. And none of this is kind of security best practice that is specific to Rasa. This is just a security architecture best practice to not expose things directly to the internet unless they're explicitly designed with that in mind.
We like to say that Rasa is an infrastructure layer, and this is one of those things, right? Great. So updating to address the security vulnerability. If you can't update, locking down permissions, locking down access to help, keep it be more secure. I don't know. That was great phrasing. So I guess another question somebody might have is, okay, so we've got, this security vulnerability. It's the first one. We had the TensorFlow 2.6 update, in part because, large enterprises said that you needed a TensorFlow update for security reasons. Is Rasa falling apart? Aren't all these security issues like a huge problem that shows that Rasa is, shoddy software? This is a little bit of a straw man.
No, not at all. Not at all. The whole idea behind disclosing these issues and patching these issues is to illustrate the fact that Rasa's security posture is maturing as an organization. We're improving how we tackle these things. We're making sure that we find things before bad actors find them, and that we fix them to help protect not only the enterprise customers, but the community users as well. So it's not a bad thing at all. No.
Okay. I would agree. I just want to get ahead of that potential question, which I can see if you've you've been using a library and suddenly they're pointing out issues that were there all along. All right. So all right, so we know what the security vulnerability is. We know what to do about it, update or take those mitigating factors. We know that, hey, it's not a problem. We value transparency with our community. I hope you all know that. And we just want to make sure that we're communicating this to you. Where else can I go for information?
So if you'd like to learn more specifically about the type of vulnerability and kind of understand more about maybe whether it's exploitable in your use case, SNYK, SNYK, are a security tooling provider who originally discovered the kind of class of exploit or vulnerability rather that this is, and they have a really good write-up that explains it all. It walks through kind of how it could be exploited and what the impact to you would be. So that's where I'd suggest going and looking, because they have a really good write-up and a really good in-depth white paper where they kind of disclosed it initially as well.
Yes. I'll just pull that up real quick
exactly
for folks. So this is, I know you can't see the address bar. It is snyk.io/research/zip-slip-vulnerability and talks more in depth. So this is also, they're using the same purple as we are. Almost the same purple. So we talked about, this current vulnerability. If something else comes up, which, I mean, we're mature software, there's a lot going on, what can you expect in the future, right? So if something else comes up, what would the process be? What if it was like a very serious bug? What if it a vulnerability? What if it was something that was like a little bit less urgent, I would say, or where the effect is a little bit smaller? Um, what would the future look like? What will the future look
Sure.
like?
Okay, so as part of the maturing security posture we've already talked about,
Mhm,
we have a process for fixing and disclosing these things now. So we have processes in place for people to disclose vulnerabilities to us externally
mhm,
if they're found externally, and we have processes for handling them internally if they're discovered through some of our security tooling or through, for example, a penetration test. What we then do is we triage basically based on the severity of it. So we have engineers and security people look at it internally. We work out the impact of it. We work out how easy it is to exploit. And we use the CVSS scoring system, which is basically an industry standard way of rating the severity of vulnerabilities that
mhm,
takes into account things like the level of permission required to be able to exploit it and the severity of the impact and things like that. And that then gives us a score kind of between 0, which is a really low severity vulnerability, and 10, which is a really critical vulnerability. And then based on that severity, we then tackle it differently. So a more severe vulnerability, like a critical, will be backported to more versions of
mhm.
Rasa to make it easier for you to update without necessarily needing to go like a whole major version or even a whole minor version, if we can do that. A lower severity vulnerability that could have less impact might just be fixed in the next version and we don't backport it at all. But it's all done and evaluated individually for each vulnerability based on the reality of the impact and the risk that it poses to users.
Great. So we definitely have stuff set up to handle anything that comes to light or that we learn about in the future.
Yeah,
And I would really quickly love to just take a look at the security alert in the GitHub repo. So this is the Rasa open source repo. And so you can see right now we have one security alert here under security. Do you want to talk us through a little bit what's going on here? What am I looking at?
sure. Okay. So there's a lot going on this screen. So you can see right at the top, we've got the actual library that's affected, which is obviously Rasa, the affected versions and the patched versions. Now they're written like that, and they're part of this vulnerability notification in such a way that if you have your own vulnerability scanning tooling, like maybe you're building a Docker image that uses Rasa or something, your tooling will be able to pick this up, and it will alert you using your own tooling to the fact that there's a vulnerability in the version of Rust that you're using. We have the big screen of text in the middle that explains kind of the impact, where it's patched, and any workarounds or mitigations for it.
Mhm.
Now, this is the standard template that we'll be using for any future vulnerability disclosure, and this is where we'll be publishing all of them in the future as well. Over on the right-hand side, we've got the CVE ID. So a CVE is essentially an identifier that is kind of globally unique and is used to represent this vulnerability. There are a set of industry bodies that issue these, and it lets us feed info into vulnerability scanners, like I've just mentioned, and it lets you easily track fixes and vulnerabilities that affect you as well. The CWE is stands for Common Weakness Enumeration, I think. And if you mouse over the CWE 23, you will see that it basically defines the type of vulnerability
Mhm.
that this is. So a vulnerability could have one or more CWEs, and basically they kind of define like the class of vulnerability or an overview of what type of vulnerability it actually is. And then finally, we have the CVSS score, which is a horrible looking string that basically defines to those who can read it um, the severity of the vulnerability based
Mhm.
on a number of factors. And I don't know what all of those things are short for off by heart, um, but it basically defines things. So AV colon N, for example, stands for attack vector is network, and the attack vector is kind of how connected or close you have to be to the affected software to be able to exploit it. And network obviously means it can be done over the network. And another example of that could be physical. So you literally need to be in physical proximity to the device to be able to do it. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to remember what all of the other ones are. But this is a standard format within the security industry, and there's plenty of kind of calculators where you can plug that in, and you can get more information specifically about how we came to the decision that it was a high severity vulnerability. It's a standard formula. It's not something we've just made up.
And this is the score where you mentioned that if something is critical, so has a certain threshold, that's when we would backport it. This one is high but not critical, so it's not backported. Hence, please update.
So yes, basically, yeah. Moving forward, we'll be backporting. I think mediums and highs will be backported in the future. This one, we felt it was more important to kind of just get a patched version out as quickly as possible, as we're still maturing and defining the processes for it.
Okay, so this might be, I don't want to make any promises about engineering work, but it might be backported in the future.
It could well be if there's sufficient demand or a solid use case for it to be. Yeah. But generally, kind of the more severe the vulnerability in the future, the further back it will be backported, to make it easier for the larger number of people as possible, to be able to take advantage of the patch.
And I don't think it is a secret at this point that the engineering team, well, parts of the engineering team are working very hard on 3.0, which I think also affected capacity in this particular issue.
Yeah.
Oh. Sorry, throwing my mouse. Amina wants to know, how did you guys discover vulnerabilities? Is there an alerting system that you use?
So there are a few ways you can discover vulnerabilities within your own code. At many stages of the development pipeline, to be honest. So specifically for us, this one was found with some security tooling that we've integrated recently into our build pipeline. And it's a type of tooling called static analysis, which basically looks at the code that is written, and it kind of compares this against rules, and it kind of builds a model of how the code flows, and tries to work out if there are kind of suspicious patterns that could indicate a vulnerability being introduced. So it's not a guaranteed way to find vulnerabilities. It's also not a guaranteed way that every finding that your static analysis tool finds will be a terrible vulnerability that it immediately needs to be fixed. There are plenty of false positives, but it kind of gives you a starting point to look at and to triage issues. Also in the future, we may find issues through penetration testing, where we kind of get third-party contractors to look through our code and try explicitly to find these sorts of things in the future.
I think that dovetails well with another question, which is, if a community member or one of our developers finds a vulnerability in the future, what should they do? Should they file an issue?
Great question. So we'd ask you not to file a public issue straight away, because that could, if it's a serious flaw, for example, it could put other people at risk whilst we work on a fix. So if you could go back one page, actually, just to our security advisory section, and then go to the security policy tab there. There you go, the contact at the top. So we ask that you email security@rasa.com. And what we will then do is we will work with you to work out if it's a vulnerability, how we can fix it, the severity of it, and kind of work from there. Yeah. So we ask people, please don't publicize things, responsibly disclose it to us, and we'll work with you to triage it and get a fix.
Yeah, which is, I think, pretty different from the other ways that we ask you to interact with us. I would also ask that you not post about it on the forums, please. All right. Question for Ravi. Is it released 3.0? And I think Ravi's asking if it's going to be fixed in 3.0 as well, rather than
Yes.
3.0 release. The answer to that is no.
Yes, so the fix will be in 3.0, and the fix is on the 2.8 branch as well, from 2.8.10 and newer. So yes, it will be fixed in version 3.
Just waiting to see if there are any additional questions. I think I've actually covered all the things I wanted to talk about. I feel like we've been very efficient in this office hours. So I'll give the community some more time if they have questions they want to ask. I just sort of like generally for you, I know you haven't been working with the Rasa library super long, but do you have any specific tips or pointers or tricks or recommendations to the community? I know you mentioned not exposing your Rasa assistant directly to the internet, but anything else?
So that's probably the most major one, to be honest, because purely because it is so risky. It's also we see from kind of internet scanning ourselves that a lot of people expose these things directly to the internet and then never patch them, which
Mm-hmm.
is really not ideal. So please don't expose it directly. Make sure you're patching as often as possible and keeping as close to the latest version as you can. And kind of just consider security as part of your design. If you're deploying an application that's using Rasa, think about it as its own little thing that can be secured in the same way that you would kind of deploy like a web server and a front end and a database in different tiers of your network. Think of it like that. Don't think of it just like something that's kind of slapped on the internet and left for itself. Is probably the most important one, I would suggest.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe even planning extra time in your development life cycle to make sure that you have enough time to do that. You're not like rushing at the end.
Exactly.
Yeah. Jai Kumar says hi, hi. And it looks like there's a question that I think might have gotten answered. Um, yeah. So, uh, another question: Does is finding vulnerabilities a part of QA?
That's a good question. So it can be, but it's not the dedicated function of QA, right? So QA obviously will often find bugs. It may turn out that those bugs could be vulnerabilities, but actually finding the vulnerabilities and introducing the tooling to be able to find this stuff before we release software
Mhm.
is it's a distinct competency kind of. It's more usually in larger organizations there are dedicated security staff who work on things like this, which isn't to say that if you're doing QA you shouldn't be doing that. If you're doing QA already, you've kind of got the mindset for finding these things already, so that it's not a big step to kind of transition from a QA role into a security role. So yes, you can find them in this role, but it's not necessarily kind of the only role where you can do things like that.
And I have a little bit of a curveball question. I should probably not use sports metaphors. I have a all of the metaphors for this are baseball related. I have a question that you are free to say that you don't know or not answer. So
Okay.
obviously, machine learning. Rasa is a machine learning based framework. Is there
Yeah.
anything specific to machine learning to consider with security that you know of off the top of your head?
Yes. Yes. There are lots of things. There's a whole field of research into this stuff called adversarial machine learning, and you also need to be careful with machine learning, especially around kind of the training time, that biases or deliberate errors can be introduced at that time through like poison data sets and things like that. So yes, that is a concern. It's an active area of research because it's kind of such a new and emerging field. Um, but also at the same time, while it can be tempting to kind of focus on the really cool cutting edge stuff, as we can see from this, it's also really important to focus on just the good software engineering practices of finding kind of regular vulnerabilities even before you get to the complex next gen AI attacks.
And I would say probably the good news for most Rasa developers is that, especially if there's a lot of security around what your chatbot can actually do and making sure that you have good authentication, because we're not doing a lot of generative language stuff. And also, hopefully, you're looking at your data before you just add it to your model's training data and retrain. Um, Hopefully, that process should help avoid some of the more egregious types of things that you can run into.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think that kind of extremely sophisticated attacks on like training models and things are necessarily something that should be front of mind for security when dealing with Rasa. Yeah.
Huh. And just sort of another question. Oh, wait, from Amina. Can we create a chatbot that tries to find vulnerabilities and helps to identify them?
Uh, I guess that you could. I guess you could implement kind of custom actions that do scans or check for specific exploits. So yeah, I don't see any reason why not. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like a fun project for somebody. Uh, I don't see any other follow-up questions there, but please feel free to ask them. Another sort of general question, so particularly maybe for more junior software engineers or just anyone who wants to learn more about security best practices in general, do you have any good
Sure.
resources you would recommend for someone who's newer to the space? Maybe you're good for beginners who understand the software development lifecycle, but are like, also I want to be secure.
Sure. Okay. So one good resource that I've been using recently to help some of the team are Snick have more content for learning as well. I think
Mhm.
it's called Snick Learn, coincidentally. Um, there are also a lot of really good O'Reilly books around application security. I think there's one called Agile Application Security that is particularly good for kind of integrating, learning more about the kind of tools that you need to integrate into a pipeline and to add security into your agile software development efforts. And if you're looking at more of a kind of infrastructure type thing, they have one called the Defensive Security Handbook, which is also really good for less programming stuff, but more kind of general security operations as well.
Oh, great. So some good resources to check out if you want to learn more.
Yep. And OWASP as well, of course. Can't believe I forgot about that one. So Snick Learn is free.
Mhm.
OWASP as well have cheat sheets for basically any kind of security sensitive thing that you may end up implementing
Mhm.
um, around kind of things like authentication or encryption and things like that. And it kind of gives you a really short overview of here are the things that you should be doing, here are the things you definitely shouldn't be doing, and it can kind of help guide you to a secure implementation from the start.
And it was OVAS?
OWASP,
Oh,
the Open Web
OWASP.
Application Security Project. Yeah. So there's a lot of good resources from them. Every few years, they come out with they come up with a list of kind of the top vulnerabilities that people are seeing in not just web applications, despite the name, but kind of all sorts of software. And it can help you kind of focus in on the areas that you need to look at more within your code and identify the areas where security risks could be introduced and help you tackle them as well. So there's a lot of good content on this on this website.
So it was SNCC, OWASP, and then some of the O'Reilly books around specific topics.
Yeah, they're all pretty good resources, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Hopefully that'll be useful to folks. And thinking about a little bit more the you know Rasa assistance in production, particularly if you're working in an enterprise case, you're building your assistant. At what point would it make sense to say add a security professional to the team or to loop one in? At what point in the Rasa chatbot development process do you want to start thinking about security?
Sure. So from the very beginning, to be honest, there are opportunities for security to provide input to the process at kind of all levels. So um, for all but the very simplest of chatbots, so for any kind of enterprise use case, you're going to be writing custom actions. And those custom actions should be treated the same way as you would treat any other software that your business is developing. So you need to make sure that there aren't vulnerabilities in the code that you write that is then executed by interactions with the chatbot. You also want to consider security from an architecture point of view, like we've spoken about, and even the layer beneath that as well. You want to make sure that the infrastructure you're deploying your chatbot, excuse me, onto is as secure and well designed as possible. Yeah. So from the very beginning is best.
Ah, particularly, it sounds like if you're running custom actions, it sounds like an area of particular attention where you should pay attention to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. And I'm just going to give folks a couple more minutes. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them. We're very lucky to have some of Jamie's time today. So thank you so much for for that.
No
Um,
problem.
oh, and here we have one. Amina wants to know, can we pay, sorry, one sec. Let me turn on my reading brain. Uh, can we be faced with vulnerability problems if we're working on localhost? Can someone use it to hack or do something malicious while working locally? So this is when something's not facing the web or not exposed to
Sure.
the web. Do you still need to think about these security issues?
Um, so the security issues around kind of like access to the API or whatever are somewhat, it's a complex answer, somewhat mitigated by working on localhost, but also very dependent on your configuration. So if you're if the device you're working on has a firewall on it and it's not allowing any incoming connections at all, and you're just exposing the ports onto localhost, then you're probably safe from kind of external network-based threats, unless you happen to have malware already on your laptop. But then you're in a slightly bad place already anyway. Where you need to be careful is that you're not accidentally exposing these things. So you're not, for example, when you start up Rasa and it binds to ports, you want to make sure that you're definitely binding just to localhost and not binding to kind of the external interfaces on your device, because then you may find that actually you think you're working on localhost, but you are exposing things publicly within your local network. And if that's kind of in a cafe or in a hotel or something like that, then you may unintentionally expose these interfaces to more people than you intended to.
Yeah, good to keep in mind. How would you know that you were doing that? How could you check that you were to check to see if you were exposing something to your local network you didn't mean to?
Sure. So for like within the Docker files, for example, if you're using Docker um, to run your deployments, you can kind of look at the interface configuration that you have in there and making sure that you're binding to localhost and not 0.0.0 to kind of bind to all of your interfaces. If you really wanted to check otherwise, I'm not particularly sure exactly how it would be done with RAS. Unfortunately, as Rachel said, I am quite new. So
Yeah, no worries. Good to keep in mind though. Uh, question from Jai Kumar. Hello, I am learning Rasa for the first time with 2.8.0. How should I learn? Help me. So I would actually recommend two things for you. So one, we actually have a learning center. Well, the thing is on the learning center. So I believe it's learn.rasa.com. Let me double check that. Nope, that ain't it. Hold, please. Can I remember URLs off the top of my head? No, not usually. So I would recommend checking out the Rasa Learning Center, which is learning.rasa.com, or you can search the Rasa Learning Center. And not all of our educational content is on here. We have a couple of YouTube series that aren't, but the conversational AI with Rasa course is designed to get you started, and it is currently it is for 2.0, and we are, thinking about the 3.0 update. Believe me, it is top of mind for us. So we have videos with introductions to Rasa, things you need to know, everything you need to know to get started. And we have the videos, and then also the sort of write-up and additional exercises and links. So I would check that out. That's probably the easiest place to get started if you want a guided learning journey and not just to look through the docs and figure it out for yourself. All right. Great. So, a question from Ravi. I, if you prefer not to answer this, feel free. But it is. I've heard that blockchain apps are unhackable. Can we make some component of Rasa decentralized? Is that possible? So I guess that's sort of two questions. So one, is blockchain
sure,
unhackable? And two, does it make sense to make Rasa decentralized?
sure, okay. So no, I don't think blockchain is unhackable. Nothing is unhackable. Anything that claims to be perfectly secure is a red flag, to be honest. It's just not feasible to do. And blockchain isn't anything special. It's not an exception to that rule. In terms of making Rasa decentralized. I'm not really sure the use case that you have in mind for that. It's not really. I'm not sure. Rachel, do you have any insight into this one?
I sounds like something I probably wouldn't want to do. is my stance on that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I think so.
yeah, so I would. Yeah, I would. Plus one Jamie unhackable is like. For me, it's in the same category as somebody who claims their NLP works with any language. It doesn't. Like I appreciate where you're coming from, but you were wrong, and I hope that you were just misguided and not actively lying to me.
It's a noble goal,
Yes,
but
absolutely.
often when if it's used in um, marketing for a product or service, especially, it can be a bit of a red flag. Yeah.
Uh, Another. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, Jayakumar. It's Maru. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading today. Apologies. Amina has a great question that actually I think you've talked about a little bit with us. As a security engineer, how do you handle passwords? I'm using Dashlane. Do you recommend this kind of tool?
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't go wrong with a password manager. Dashlane is a perfectly reputable one. It's a good choice. But yeah, it's a really good idea to use a password manager to end up with unique passwords for all your websites, and to enable 2FA everywhere you can while you're at it as well. Yeah.
Um,
Really good question.
just for someone who maybe hasn't heard of it, what is 2FA and how would I enable that?
So 2FA is two-factor authentication. It can also be called multi-factor authentication depending on the service. And basically the idea behind that is that in order to log in or authenticate with a service, you need something that you know, which is your password, even if it's your password manager that knows it and not necessarily you personally. Um, and something that you have as well. And the something that you have is usually a smartphone. So you can get apps that will generate codes for that. You can get them texted to you, although that's kind of the worst way to do it over SMS. Or you can have physical security keys as well, which are kind of look like little USB stick things that you can put in your device and use to help you authenticate. Most kind of major online services are starting to support this now. If you use anything from any kind of big or medium-sized tech company, it will probably support this. You can generally find the settings for it in the next to where you change your password, so in the kind of the account settings and stuff. And what this means is that if somebody does manage to compromise your password, they don't compromise your entire account, because they need something in addition to that. They need something that you have usually on your person. So it becomes a lot harder to compromise your accounts.
Um, and for the little keys, I really like they have some that are like USB-C and very very slim, and you can just leave them in the port as long as your
Yeah.
laptop is in a safe place.
These kind of keys are the gold standard of authentication security. It's if you've got something that you really want to protect, then you can do a lot worse than going for something like that. Yeah.
Uh, Another question from Amina. Since everything is hackable, is it part of your job to make things harder to hack?
Yes. So through um,
Okay.
so through efforts like this, by patching software, we're making this harder to hack by disclosing it after a fix has been introduced, and not, for example, publicly on a forum beforehand. We're making things harder. So just to circle back to that earlier, when we ask you to disclose issues that you may have found with Rasa responsibly to us, it's not about us wanting to keep it a secret and hush it up. It's about wanting to protect the community and the end users by making sure that the knowledge about it is not widely known before we have a fix in place that can protect people. And you can also, all sorts of things. Secure programming. You can design your architecture to be secure and to take specific defensive steps, depending on what you're making. And there's kind of a call that you need to make for how much kind of time and effort and money you need to spend on security, depending on what it is that you're building. You know.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to point a big sign, a big flashing neon sign that says security vulnerability. Right now it's hackable using this specific method. Don't do it
Yeah,
though. Um,
exactly.
but we will say, hey, please fix this once it's fixed.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think that's related
exactly.
to a little bit. Perhaps people have heard of 0 day. What's a 0 day?
So a 0 day is when a vulnerability is announced when there is no patch for it. So it's kind of taken the vendor by surprise. So if, for example, someone went onto Twitter and released an iOS 0 day, what that would mean is that there is a vulnerability in iOS that other people know about and they're learning about it at the same time Apple is. So Apple is now trying to make a patch whilst everybody else is vulnerable to it and other people might be trying to attack it at the same time. So it's not ideal. If you're a vendor, it's not ideal. If you're an end user, it's also not ideal because you're at risk because of that lack of responsible disclosure.
Uh, we would like to avoid that.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about password managers. We talked a little bit about 2FA, two-factor authentication. Are there any any other general tips you'd recommend for sort of everybody, whether or not they work in security, to help make stuff more secure?
Sure. So password managers and two-factor authentication are the key ones because they're applicable to everybody, regardless of what devices and services that you're using. Also, it's just really boring. Just keep things up to date. You know, patch your devices, keep your browser up to date, patch your phone, things like that. Take updates when they're offered to you because often you're making yourself a harder target, and attackers aren't looking for hard targets. They're looking for the lowest common denominator. Often they're looking for people who are still running Windows XP and haven't patched in a decade. You know, they're not looking for people who are running the latest Mac OS with all the latest security patches on it, because if you make yourself too hard a target, you just get passed over and they go to someone else.
So do update. Don't
Yeah.
just hit ignore 100 times, which I think we've all probably been guilty of at one point or another. We have another question for Amina. Is it important where your servers are? For example, if they're in Europe or farther away, if you were in Europe, does it impact security?
So it can do, depending on what your threat model is. So a threat model is basically what you anticipate the risks are to the service that you're operating, for example. So what probably impacts security more than location for most people is the provider that they've chosen. So if you're, I'm assuming you're talking about like cloud providers, you know, pick a reputable one. Don't pick one that's just a guy with some stuff in his garage. Because a lot of the security controls that are applied and managed by these big cloud providers are far in excess of what you could manage to run it yourself, or without the same kind of budget that these people are operating under. Server location is more a thing for compliance rather than security necessarily. So often, I know the US has regulations, the EU has regulations around data residency, which is basically where the data that your services are consuming is physically located for your users. So it can be a security thing, but it's more about location is more about a compliance thing. And in terms of security, I would look more to the providers that you're picking and then the configuration that you're responsible for on top. They're the things that have bigger impacts on security.
Definitely. Oh wow, lots of great questions. So again from Mina, what kind of profiles work on securing Rasa? So I think this is profiles of individuals, DevOps, QA. Do you need solutions engineers somewhere on the front line?
Yeah, really good question. All of them really. So the QA definitely play a part because, as we've talked about already, bugs can quite easily turn into vulnerabilities. Not every one is obviously, but it can be there. So it's important to find these things. As you improve software quality, you improve the security of it as well. DevOps people are extremely useful for making sure that the kind of infrastructure layer is secured. And making sure that the deployment you eventually come up with is kind of best practice and nice and secure. And for solutions architects and solutions engineers as well, yeah, it's really important for our customers that we can tell them, look, this is how you should be deploying it for our best practices and for the best practices that that you will want as well to ensure these things are secure. So yeah, every role that kind of interacts with Rasa or with our customers has a security part to it. Yeah,
It's, it's like littering. It's everybody's job a little bit.
exactly. Yeah.
Not to litter, but to not litter, to be clear. I'm not suggesting you go litter. Uh, yeah. Oh, another really good question. What do you think about cookies? Security wise, is it good as a user? Should I click on and accept the cookies?
Um, Cookies are more of a privacy thing than a security thing, really, without wanting to kind of delve into the depths of like how authentication works and things like that. It's more a privacy thing. It's more a personal call, to be honest. You can accept this stuff if you want. You can introduce kind of browser extensions that will block these things or auto accept it for you. It's purely down to a matter of personal preference. It's worth learning a bit about how these things work so you can make an informed decision. But it's not a factor that hugely impacts security. It's more a privacy thing.
Yeah. And I will just say, for a little bit tangential, but folks who are, concerned about tracking or want to learn more about it, not just cookies, but also the specific browser that you use has implications there as well. So I would look into them and see if one fits your personal needs a little bit better than others.
It's a very good point.
Uh, Let me double check. We had like a bunch of great questions in a row, and I think we're in a little bit of a lull. Um, yeah. Oh, Pratyush asks, isn't it about sessions, cookies?
Yeah. So yeah, sorry. I thought the previous one was about specifically like the kind of accept cookie banners and stuff. So yeah, you can. There can be vulnerabilities that are introduced by kind of mishandling cookies or not authenticating them properly on the server side. Browsers have a lot of protection and mitigation built in to try and stop these kind of attacks. But yeah, it's absolutely something that can impact security. If you're talking specifically about things like sessions, sorry, I thought you were just talking more about kind of cookies as a tracking medium in general. Yeah.
Okay. And those were, I think, questions from two different folks. So I think it's
Oh,
good that
okay.
we
So,
answered both. Yeah.
well, you've both got an answer now. So,
Oh, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about resources for developers who are interested in learning a little bit more about security. But if someone was just like really interested in this, and maybe you've been watching this interview and you've been like, I must learn more, maybe I want to be a security engineer, what would the sort of general path be? I mean, obviously, different specializations have very different paths for how people get into them, but what's sort of a common way to get into the space?
so a really common way is nice and not too expensive. Actually, it's not a kind of go to university for years and years and come out as a cybersecurity professional. It's very much a common thing to kind of just do self learning for security careers. So there are some really good websites that have a lot of courses on this stuff, like Udemy or Pluralsight or Cloud Guru. Specifically has a lot of good content for cloud specific security or infrastructure roles as well. But there is an absolute wealth of information out there that you can access either for free or very cheaply to kind of self teach a lot of this stuff. You don't really need any specific background to be able to pick it up. It's pretty accessible. As long as you don't approach it with the idea that you're going to watch a 20-minute Udemy course and you're going to be a pro hacker. It doesn't really work like that. It's also worth looking at what roles are actually available within cybersecurity, because it is not just you work in security or you don't. There are dozens of roles depending on whether you're more interested in kind of compliance stuff and risk and corporate governance, or whether you want to defend infrastructure, whether you're looking to hack software through pen testing. Like there's a huge range of kind of career opportunities. So if you don't like one part of it, don't assume that you're just turned off security completely. There's a huge range of things that you can do, and it's really easy to learn a lot of this stuff either for free or very cheaply.
Yeah, it's great to learn. And even if you just wanted to, learn more for your own work as a developer, I think it would be,
Yeah,
there's a lot of resources, it sounds like.
yeah.
Uh, Patty says, I just woke up and missed preparing for this. Thanks, though. Yeah, no worries. You never have to prepare for office hours. You can just come and ask your questions. Uh, Robbie wants to know, do you use Kali Linux?
I don't personally, but if you're looking to kind of get started in a lot of security testing stuff, it's really good to have everything kind of packaged up um, for you ready. So for those who aren't aware, Kali is a Linux distro that is specifically kind of packaged and tuned for doing security testing and penetration testing work. So don't feel you have to. You can use whatever tool sets you like or whatever works for you. But if you're just getting started, it can be really useful to have kind of all these tools already pre-packaged up and ready to use. Yeah.
Noah wants to know, how many languages does Rasa support? So I'm assuming this is human languages, Noah. I like to say that we're language agnostic. So we provide example toolings in a couple different languages, but because we're open source and because we're modular, you can add in your own components to the pipeline. And if the components exist, we should support the language. So in theory, if you have the tooling, any language that has a writing system and that written data exists for, just to be very broad. I don't believe we officially support any language. We're sort of like the US, right? The US doesn't have an official human language. So Rasa also doesn't have an official human language, but our doc's in English because that's what everyone speaks. I should say it's not the only language everyone speaks. We're a very multilingual team. And now a question about computer languages. Also, if you're asking about computer languages, we have a Python SDK, but you can also, we're open source, so if you want to build your own SDK, please feel free. Tobias has one in Go that I believe has been open sourced if you want to use that one as well, but I don't know that it's actively supported. Sorry, little tangent there. Mina wants to know, what kind of language do you use when you are a security engineer for coding? Is there a specific one, or does it depend, or are there many? So if you were looking to add a language to your tool belt, which one would you recommend maybe, or do you need to?
Okay. So so security engineer is one specific role within kind of the security industry. That is quite a technical role. It's kind of like being a security professional on top of being a dev. So being able to code for that role certainly helps. Um, the languages that you know kind of need to be dependent on where you want to work and the stuff that you want to work on if you want to work as a security engineer to be able to kind of help with code reviews and secure coding and things like that. If you were to pick kind of one, Python is a really good one to pick up. It's very useful for all sorts of things. It's very kind of quick to learn, and you will always find that kind of in demand. There is always things that need to be implemented in code quickly for security purposes, and Python's a solid choice for that. And then once you've learned it, you can come and contribute to Rasa as well.
Yes, please. We'd love to have you. Yeah, Robbie says NLP is dominated by English. Yes, unfortunately, there are really strong biases in the field. Noah says, can Rasa work on car devices? Ooh, you could probably make it work. I don't know off the top of my head if anyone has something running on a car, but I don't see why it couldn't, as long as it can handle the dependencies. And I know that there are developers who've made it, have made Rasa work on embedded systems. So yeah, I think it should. Obviously, security would be very important in that situation to make sure that people aren't messing with your car or the user's car. Craig wants to know, given that the OWASP top 10 has remained fairly static, do you think the industry is still fairly ignorant of security and software despite the high profile of many security incidences?
It's a good question. I think, yeah, to be honest. So the OWASP issue a new top 10 every few years. There's not really a pattern to it. And the things change a little bit, but the broad themes are always the same. Maybe the names of what they call them change, and things move up and down the list, but things don't change a great deal, which, yeah, suggests that not enough progress is being made, kind of uh, the entirety of the software development industry really needs to take these things more seriously, because as we've seen, they can have really serious impacts when there are vulnerabilities that are not addressed. Like a few years ago, when the UK's NHS was completely crippled by a ransomware attack, and these things are only becoming more common. So yeah, I think the entire industry needs to take it a lot more seriously, and recognize that there are impacts to real people as a result of not doing this well.
Oh, definitely. Uh, Robbie, more questions about the personal assistant for cars with Rasa. I think we answered that. Um, uh, Pratyush says, I think JavaScript, Python, and C is the broadest coverage. JavaScript covers web, Python has lots of uses in scripts, and C-Lang is good for low-level security-wise. Somebody else's
So
recommendation.
C is very difficult to write securely. It's worth bearing in mind. Um, if you're Because it's so low level, it's really easy to screw up, like really easy. And you can introduce classes of vulnerabilities with that you simply don't have to worry about with other languages, because all that's handled for you. So if you are extremely confident with what you're doing, you can write secure C code, but it's very, very difficult. So some of the kind of the newer replacement languages that are quite low level are better choices if you're starting off a new project and you want it to be secure.
Oh, good to know. I did not know that. Noah says, I mean languages besides English. Yes, so we do support languages besides English. And for Noah specifically, I would look up the video Non-English NLP on our channel. It's in the NLP for Developers series. I go over a lot of the specific changes that you might need to make for different classes of languages. And it is quite broad in coverage. So hopefully your target language has relevant information there. Yeah. And then some more sort of general chat in the just sort of back and forth between people in the chat. Yeah. So I'm just gonna keep an eye on that to see if there's. Oh wait, there's another question. Patu says, I think it's more like this was about the JavaScript Python C recommendation. I think it's more like you should know because you can check for buffer overflow attacks. But basically, yeah.
There are a lot of different classes of vulnerability that you can introduce with C unintentionally. So yeah, my personal suggestion is that you should steer clear of C, because it's so hard to do well, even if you think you know what you're doing. Why cause yourself the hassle? Pick something that can handle some of this stuff for you, and means you can focus on like the security of the algorithms that you're developing, rather than the security of what the code is actually doing underneath.
Yeah, I think that's solid advice. Also, I would prefer not to work in C personally. So probably you're going to be working with teams that don't have a big C code base. I would assume much of the time. Sorry, that face is me thinking about how much of NLP stuff still runs on Perl, which I realize is not C, but yeah, sort of similar. Anyway, so I think it's about time to wrap up. I want to make sure, I know it's quite late for you, that I don't keep you any longer than we need to. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jamie. I think it was a really good discussion. I think a lot of questions got answered. I hope everyone is, if not excited, resigned to thinking about security and acting in a secure way. And if things come up again, we'll announce them. I believe, is there a forum post about the?
Yes, there is. Yep.
So check out the forum if you want more details, or I've zoomed in so you can't quite see it, but the security is like a little shield right here, and then we have security policy. If you find any security issues, please email this address. Do not file a public issue. Do not post on the forums. We would really appreciate it. It'll help us protect everybody a little bit better. And one final little call to action, please update to 2.8.10 or above. It'll be continued to be fixed in the future to handle this particular issue so that it doesn't affect you. And if you can't update, then do work through some of these mitigation steps to help protect yourself and your users. Um, and tomorrow, there is going to be the usual stream at the new time, which is 1 p.m. And I'm going to be doing a little game slow slash quiz on the bot design slash implementation process, trying to figure out, given a use case, whether an intent or the entity is the best way to capture a specific piece of information, which I've been getting a lot of questions about recently. So hopefully that'll be really helpful for everybody. So thank you so much for joining today, Jamie. Thank you, everybody in the chat. You had some fantastic questions, as always. And I will see you tomorrow. And yeah, keep an eye on those security advisories and update, please. Thanks so much. Bye.